Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Zakiya Dalila Harris presenting her new book, The Other Black Girl. She'll be talking with Brit Bennett, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Zakiya, Brit, and the team at Atria Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And if you see a fellow attendee's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote that to send it towards the top of the queue. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Other Black Girl, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Zakiya's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. Zakiya is stopping by our store to sign copies of the book, so you can get a signed or even personalized book by request while supplies last. Make sure to indicate your signed copy request and order comments at checkout when ordering online, or look for signed copies when you visit the store. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Brit Bennett. Born and raised in Southern California, she graduated from Stanford University and later earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award in graduate short fiction. In 2014, she received the Hurston Wright Award for college writers. She's a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree, and her debut novel, The Mothers, was a New York Times bestseller. Her second novel, The Vanishing Half, was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Her essays have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Paris Review, and Jezebel. She will be speaking with our featured author, Zakiya Dalila Harris. She spent nearly 3 years in the editorial department at Knopf Doubleday before leaving to write her debut novel, The Other Black Girl. Prior to working in publishing, Zakiya received her MFA in creative writing from the New School. Her essays and book reviews have appeared in Guernica and The Rumpus. She lives in Brooklyn. Her new book, The Other Black Girl, is an electric debut about the tension that unfurls when two young Black women meet against the starkly white backdrop of New York City book publishing. The book has been praised by a multitude of fellow writers, including Emily St. John Mandel, Walter Mosley, Elizabeth Thomas, Attica Locke, and Phoebe Robinson, who says, "The Other Black Girl is unlike anything I've ever read before. Wholly original, powerful, and a gripping page-turner. This is the kind of book that turns authors into stars and the readers into rabid fans. I cannot wait to see what Zakiya does next." Zakiya is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Brit and with all of you. Zakiya, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. I don't even know what to say. I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I feel like I have been really waiting for this day for a very, very long time. So just want to say really quickly, thank you, Greenlight, for holding my book launch event. Thank you so much, Brit, for moderating and for chatting with me today. Vanishing was the first book, by the way, that I read during COVID last year, and it it was a time, but the Vanishing really set it off kind of in, I don't know, in the right way for me. I think in the headspace that it was just such a good book and such a great read. And so thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone. So I'm going to read from chapter 1. I won't go into the synopsis too much now. We already kind of chatted about it, but the main protagonist is Nella Rogers, who has been the only Black person working at Wagner Books for the last 2 years. So she's very starved for any contact, any kind of other Black employee, and that person comes in the form of Hazel, who will be eventually working in the cubicle alongside Nella's. That's not a spoiler, it's in the flap copy. So I'm just going to start from the beginning of the chapter where Nella spies Hazel through the cube walls. The footsteps were only inches away now. Nella realized she'd be able to get a good glimpse at the newcomer if she slid over to the far right of her cube, so she did exactly that, pretending to leaf through the manuscript Vera was waiting on while keeping one eye trained on the strip of hallway that led to Maisie's office. Almost instantly, Maisie and her prospective dreadlocked assistant made their way into her periphery, and the full picture came to view. The girl had a wide, symmetrical face, and 2 almond-colored eyes perfectly spaced between a Lena Horne nose and a generous forehead. Her skin was a shade or two darker than Nella's chestnut complexion, falling somewhere between hickory and umber. And her locks, every one as thick as a bubble tea straw and longer than her arms, started out as a deep brown, then turned honey blonde as they continued past her ears. She'd gathered a bunch and piled them on top of her head in a bun. The locks that hadn't made it hung loosely around the nape of her neck. And then there was the girl's pantsuit, a smart-looking ensemble composed of a single-button marigold jacket and a matching pair of oversized slacks that hit a couple of inches above the ankle. Below that, a pair of red patent leather high-heeled ankle boots that Nella would have broken her neck just trying to get into. It was all very Erica meets Issa, another detail Nella was filing away for Malika, when she heard Maisie ask the girl to explain what ACP meant. And it was a good thing she had, because Nella hadn't known either. "Oh, sorry, that's Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard," the girl said, "but that's kind of a mouthful." "Oh, of course, a mouthful indeed. Harlem is such a great neighborhood. Its history is just so rich. Wagner held an event at the Schomburg earlier this year, February I think it was, for one of our authors. It was very well received." Nella fought back a snort. Maisie hadn't attended this aforementioned event. What's more, Nella was willing to bet her middle name that the Museum of Natural History was as far north as Maisie had ever traveled in Manhattan. Maisie was a kind enough woman, She made bathroom small talk as well as the next senior level employee, but she was fairly limited in her sense of what the city entailed. Just the mention of Williamsburg, despite its Apple Store, Whole Foods, and devastating selection of designer boutiques, caused Maisie to recoil as though someone had just asked to see the inside of her vagina. Surely this dreadlocked girl could sense that Maisie had no true sense of Harlem's culture. Nella wished she could see the look in the black girl's face, but they'd already started to enter Maisie's office, so she had to settle for a chuckle in its place. It was subtle, but in the milliseconds that passed before Maisie shut her door, Nella was able to detect amusement at the end of that chuckle. An exasperated kind of amusement that asked, without asking, "You don't spend time with Black people often, do you?" Nella crossed her fingers. The girl probably didn't need it, but she wished her luck anyway.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading that. And yeah, thank you for having me here to do this event with you. It's so exciting. And thank you everyone for coming. Just as a reminder, please drop your questions into the Q&A box. I have a bunch, but I think we would love to get to your questions a little bit later. So I guess I will jump in. Well, first, congrats. I mean, I have not seen a debut received with this level. I don't think I've ever seen a debut really received with this level of excitement, really. And I remember hearing when I heard that this book was announced, I think last year, I remember immediately the Black people I knew in publishing were just like, we have to get a galley of this book. There was an immediate sort of palpable excitement for this book. So congrats for everything that has already come your way with this book, everything that is coming your way with this book. And it's really exciting to be part of your launch. So let me just jump into some of the questions I have. So my first question, I suppose, is, and I think your bio speaks to this, that you used to work in publishing. So what was the spark for this story? How did it begin for you for this book?
Yeah. I mean, I had multiple sparks, but the biggest spark, I would say, came during my time there, toward the end of my time there. At this point, I was very aware that working in editing wasn't really my thing, that I wanted to write. And so I'm at that point mentally, and I'm standing in the bathroom washing my hands at work, and this other Black woman comes out of the bathroom stall. And at the time, I was the only Black woman working on the floor as far as I knew. And so I just remember looking at her and being like, wow, like, who is this person? Like, I could tell she wasn't, I knew she wasn't an author for some reason. I think she had a work badge with her. And so I was kind of like looking at her, I think when I look back in this moment, I'm like, was I actually like sending signs that I wanted to chat? I don't know, but I know I wanted to. Sometimes I can be very introverted. So I'm having this moment kind of looking at her, and nothing happens. Like, bottom line, nothing happens. I leave the bathroom and I'm going back to my desk, and I'm thinking about that interaction and like how like thirsty I was for some kind of something. Like, I mean, I was raised definitely by parents who like smile and nod at other Black people when they're in the same space. Especially, I grew up in Connecticut, so like I feel like that's also a common thing where I was from. And so I think having that, I had gone into that interaction, or lack thereof interaction, in the bathroom thinking maybe we'd have that. But then I was thinking more so not about her, because it's the bathroom. I get it. That's not a place to talk sometimes. But like thinking, about myself and why I was so hungry for that communication, why I felt a little bit of a way after leaving that lack of, interaction. And then I went back to my cubicle, and I had this idea that I messaged to my good friend, Sincere, and I was like, hey, I have this idea for this novel about two Black women working in a white workplace. I don't know if I said white workplace versus publishing, but knew it was going to be a white workplace. And then shit gets weird, excuse me. But like, that was the main thing I had. And there were some other parts that I won't say now because I don't want to give it away, but that was really like the spark initially that really got me going. But I mean, there are other sparks of like working in publishing, being one of so few Black people, and feeling, you know, like change wasn't happening to make publishing diverse enough. A lot of parts of the book, you know, I mean, talking about the vibe of Wagner Books, that was something that I had in the back of my mind of just like, why aren't we having these conversations about diversity in a more concrete way? And so that was one spark. And then of course, my experiences very much are, there's some overlap with Nella, and you know, her growing up in a very white space is something that happened, you know, that was my experience. So trying to navigate like white spaces, being used to navigating that, but then also having this Black side that you want to be able to express at work, and all of those conflicting things really you just you know, combined and got me writing the book in my cubicle that day when I had the idea.
Right. Well, first, that's amazing that the idea came to you that organically. So this kind of leads me to my next question, which is about Nella. So the book centers on Nella, who's this ambitious editorial assistant who is struggling to survive the oppressive whiteness of publishing, and is running into various obstacles in that regard before she even meets Hazel. So how did Nella kind of come to life for you? What were you thinking about forming her as being the protagonist for the book?
Yeah. I mean, I was really channeling my own kind of anxieties, honestly, of, you know, growing up around white people, feeling so comfortable in these spaces, and then getting to middle school, high school, and meeting other Black people who I'd never met before, and getting comments like, oh, you talk like a white girl, like you participate too much, like why do you hang out with like so many non-Black people? And for me, that was really normal. So I kind of had this journey as I got older of like feeling like I didn't necessarily belong, and finding my group of like Black girlfriends in college. Shout out to Ari, I just saw you wrote in the chat, is one of them. Like having that space to like talk about like nerdy Black girl stuff, to talk about everything in between, all of the things. You know, knowing that we fit into this space that like, I don't know, like Issa Rae hadn't been a thing when I was in that time where I was like trying to navigate talking like a white girl to certain people. And so, you know, having that space to express myself was something really important to me. And I wanted to show that with Nella's experiences. She had similar experiences, again, of growing up around white people, having a kind of really stressful relationship with her hair, and like finally deciding, you know, to embrace her Blackness. And then of course, like that drives into Nella's desire to really, I mean, want a friendship with Hazel, the other Black girl who comes to work, because she hasn't had, I mean, she has Malika, she's slowly kind of, she's in Black Twitter, she's got these things forming, but having that person in that space is really meaningful for her. So
yeah, well, so my next question is about Hazel. So Nella's our protagonist, but so much of this novel is about the tension between those two characters. Hazel, who is the new Black assistant, and in the beginning, actually, I would say throughout the whole novel, Hazel is quite mysterious, and it's deeply unclear and also deeply unsettling whether she is an ally or an enemy. And I loved that kind of those moments reading it, especially early on when you see Nella kind of trying to feel Hazel out and try to determine whether this is someone she can actually trust or not. I think that's an experience that a lot of people coming from marginalized backgrounds feel, where you're wondering, you know, is this like a scarcity mindset that makes me distrust this person, or is this person actually shady? And it's unclear throughout the book. And I think so much of the tension from the book comes from that. So can you talk about, again, we will try not to spoil anything, but can we talk about Hazel, the experience of developing her, and what you wanted to think about with that character being a counterpoint to Nella?
Yeah. I mean, with Hazel, I wanted to show, of course, like first and foremost, even though it's not in the book as much, I wanted to show, you know, that desire, that urge to have kind of camaraderie with someone who understands all the microaggressions, you know, grew up the same kind of way of like having one foot in this world and one foot, you know, one foot in the Wagner white publishing world and one foot in, you know, their safe space, and which for both Nella and Hazel, or specifically for Nella, involves her with Malika, her with Owen, and her world. And so I wanted to show that. And I think through Hazel, for me, again, I was thinking a lot about my own anxieties of like the worries that I had as a young person about, you know, like, how much do you speak up? How much do you say something on this? Like, you need to be, like, I think as Black women, we are constantly told we have to be all of the things. And Nella feels this pressure to speak out, and then that has repercussions. Nella wasn't saying anything about what was going on at Wagner Books before Hazel showed up. So, and that also didn't feel great. So it's kind of this damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. And I think with Hazel, this is a tangent, but I love Lifetime movies. I love psychological thrillers, like women having really complicated relationships, because I think that's really real and also really interesting. We're not allowed to, you know, express sometimes being upset. We have to like code everything. And so I wanted to show that. But then, I mean, I also think, you know, with Black people, not to make a generalization, but we do have these like, sorry, there's like, I don't know what that is behind me. Oh, coming to you from Brooklyn, so you're gonna get all this.
I get it.
But oh, thank you. Closing the window. But the truisms that we have as Black people and how those often also contradict. I mean, we have this, I was talking earlier about the nod of how we're supposed to really help each other up and like boost each other in these spaces. And that's what Nella hopes from Hazel. But then we also have, you mentioned like the scarcity kind of complex where like there can only be one of us. Like we are just, you know, these tools. And so getting at all of that and how horrifying that can be for a Black person who, like Nella, kind of expects to get a friend was really important for me to show, because I think that's terrifying.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so without giving too much away, there's also this kind of story within the story where we get glimpses to an earlier generation of Black women in publishing. So I'm curious of why you decided to include that narrative instead of only focusing on these contemporary characters.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, when I first wrote this book, it was just through Nella's point of view. I did not have Shani, Kendra Ray, or Diana, the other 3 Black women whose voices we hear from in the novel. And afterwards, I mean, they were in the book, but they were not, we didn't get to see them on the page. And so after that first draft, I really had a moment where I was like, we need to hear from them, because I think for me and for a lot of Black people, and especially Black women, the stories that I've heard from people older than me and people older than them, going all the way back, like those are things that give us hope, give me hope, but then also kind of ground us, right? Like they remind us like how far things have changed, or how far things have come, but also how far nothing has come.
Right.
And I wanted to show that for Nella as a young Black woman working in this very white space. Kendra Ray and Diana, I should explain, Kendra Ray was an editor at Wagner Books 30 years earlier, and Diana was an author. And they had this amazing best-selling book, Burning Heart. And, you know, at the time it was seen as like, ooh, is this like a new era of publishing? Like, you know, the fact that there are these 2 Black women who are able to collaborate on this book. And that's the part that Nella knows, but there's a whole story that Nella never necessarily, I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but there's so much that the reader will learn that Nella does not know. And so I wanted to get at that the way that we romanticize the past, the way that we also, I mean, the past can fuel us, right? And I know for me, working in publishing, I also constantly, I mean, not constantly, not all the time, because that would be weird, but I definitely thought about Toni Morrison and how she had been working and publishing at a time that was way harder than it was for me. And everything was different, but still it's hard. And so ways in which like the past inform the present and really can keep us going, but then also can be a bummer. I don't know
Right.
to say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so earlier you kind of referred to this book having at least shades of a psychological thriller, and I think that's really apt. I saw somewhere that this book was described as Get Out meets The Devil Wears Prada, which is like a weird thing to hold in your head
Yeah.
because those feel like two very different stories, but I think that's accurate. And I think that this book moves through so many different modes. There's moments where it's really comedic, and we heard some of that, I think, in what you read. There are moments where it does feel like a legitimate psychological thriller. And there are moments that it veers more into horror, science fiction, more speculative modes. And of course, just I shouldn't say just, but of course, realism. It moves among all of those modes. So I'm curious about, as you were writing this book, how did you think about moving among those modes? Did you recognize that early on? Like, did you start it thinking you were writing something that was going to be strictly realist and then it moved in another direction? And were you drawing from some other texts for inspiration as you were thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I definitely knew like the again, gonna swear, shit gets weird part. Like I knew that would be a thing. I've always been into kind of like mysteries and
Mhm.
people who have different names and like mysterious notes and like all of those like underground like movements, like all of that has
Mhm.
been really kind of fascinating to me. And like I knew I knew how it would end.
Oh, that's good.
Because yeah, right. I mean, and sometimes I think that's the hardest part, right? Like
It
I,
absolutely is the hardest part. Yeah, that's
you
I'm
know.
like, that's great that you knew that.
And so I had those points, and filling them in was definitely a journey. But the all the genre elements, honestly, and structurally for me, I mean, once I went back through drafts and drafts, it was hard to implement them, but I knew in my heart it would be this kind of book because that's like who I am as a person. I mean, I am I think I'm funny sometimes, and I love horror. I love sci-fi. I love the Twilight Zone. I love Black Mirror. Those kind of stories that start in this space where we're in, and then slowly start to go down the rabbit hole. Like that is something that I just really love in a story. And looking back, I think the horror elements also made this book more like talkable. I don't know. I feel like I've been using that word a lot, even though I don't know if it's a word, but just like I think there's something to that you can cling on to through the genre element. And it's not for everyone, but I know for me, like there's no other way to really slip in, you know, the ways in which, again, trying not to spoil, but really the ways in which publishing and then just any industry in general like it that is very white and very kind of stuck in its ways. There's no way to really convey all of that for me in another way. And so
Right.
through especially through the eyes of someone like Nella, who was a young Black person trying to weigh all of these things in her mind. So I knew that was going to be part of it.
Right.
But for me, I think also it's funny because I hadn't realized it at the time necessarily when I started writing it, but I was reading Passing by Nella Larson. And the ways in which they talk about, I mean, there are two Black women who are able to pass in this book, the story, and my character Nella is actually named after Nella Larson, the author of
Right.
Passing. But I was really interested in the ways that Larson builds social tension, builds,
Right. Right.
you know, the story off of subtext and the story off of social expectations, like
Yeah.
what is pressed upon these women really drives the story. And
Yeah.
so looking back, now that I've reread Passing again, I'm like, wow, like Nella and Hazel are both clearly Black women. They cannot pass, but they're still passing in their own ways of being able to
Right.
talk. And so that also was a huge inspiration for me.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense because Passing is also, I guess, a psychological thriller in a way.
Right?
You
I
know,
think
like
so
so
too.
much of that tension is like, can I trust this person? Like all of those types of
Exactly.
questions. So that makes a lot of sense. You know, that was a book that you drew on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm also wondering what was interesting to you about exploring race through the workplace? Because I was actually thinking about this book. I was talking to somebody about this book this past weekend in conversation. with two other recent books that I really love, which were Luster and Such a Fun Age, which are
Yeah.
both also concerned with race in the workplace.
Yes.
And Luster is a character who's in publishing, but is, and I mean this very lovingly, but is like a dirtbag, like Black girl in publishing. She's really bad at her job. I love her, but like very different than Nella. Like Nella is actually like qualified, good at her job. The character in Luster is not, but they're both in those spaces. And Such a Fun Age is about a different type of transactional financial relationship between a Black woman and a white woman, but they're both concerned with race at work. So I'm curious of what was interesting to you about that, because I was thinking about this in the sort of Get Out meets Devil Wears Prada way. And in a lot of ways, I think that often the stakes can feel higher when you're thinking about work versus a relationship even, because in a lot of ways it's easier to leave a relationship than it is to leave the job that you are dependent on to live. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about thinking about race and work.
Yeah. I mean, I think the word that you use, transactional, is so important. I think for all of us, no matter who we are, working in certain spaces always comes with a degree of you're giving yourself. And you also have to cut part of yourself. Like you have to constantly navigate how much of yourself you're giving.
Right.
And I think publishing is interesting. And I say this as a girl who still has the, like, I still look at like the spine of books and think about publishers all the time and like copy. You can't take that out of me, but as much as I find it so interesting and I love its mission, I also think it can be hard because you're really asked, I think, to really throw your all and say that you really believe in a certain book. And like logistically, that's not possible. Like everyone can't be on the same page. And I don't know, I think that's really interesting. And for Nella, as a Black woman, it's especially hard because she has to, again, she feels this pressure to, as not just a young person and not just as an entry-level employee, but as a young Black woman, she's lucky to be there. She should be grateful that she's there. It's really hard to get there. And so she feels like she has to give herself to this place. And I think that's something we all navigate. And that work-life balance is definitely something I was thinking about, especially because I quit because I wanted to write this book. And I knew when I got promoted to being an assistant editor, which was amazing on one side, I also was like, this means I can't do the thing that I know also makes me happy at the same time. And some people can, but I knew I couldn't. And so that was a big part of it for me. I think also just kind of the commodification of diversity of Black people, especially, that has been happening for years. And I think happens, depending on how you look at it, I think with all of what was happening last year, you know, the tweets, just the social media outpour that happened, which, you know, I feel a lot of ways about all of it. I think it's necessary to be having those conversations, but also I do think social media can kind of lend itself to being a performative kind of tool, the performative allyship. And with a place like, again, like publishing, but again, it goes to every industry. I think that like, that is something, you know, that can be difficult. And I think that is a problem and can be a problem when just, you know, we're going to fix this problem by like putting these people here and we're not going to have to talk about this anymore. That's how it works.
So I have follow-ups for that, but before we do, let me remind everyone, please drop your questions into the Q&A box. I already see that we have had some questions pop up. I'm going to ask a few more questions and then hopefully get to yours. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box. So to the point that you were just making about publishing specifically, I had a book that came out last June, which was the moment where publishing decided it would suddenly take race seriously. I hope you can hear the air quotes in my voice. So I'm just really personally very curious of what was the experience of kind of watching that unfold and watching all this unfold as a person who both worked in publishing and wrote about publishing. And I guess a little bit more broadly than that, what has been the experience of being part of the publishing machine now as an author, which I imagine would be different than your experience before?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like the fact. I mean, first of all, I cannot imagine what that was like. Like, we need to
It was
talk.
weird.
It was very weird because it's like finally, but also like, is this actually genuine? I don't know. I go back and forth. I think that yeah, so last year was really rough for multiple reasons, even though this book was the highlight. And I think, of course, with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, going back to this book, going back into edits was difficult, feeling like it was, even though there were all of these amazing outpours, so many people, there's so much good writing, seeing things happen all over the world was incredible, but also just on an individual level, it just felt like a lot, which is also what I'm trying to get at with Nella's experiences working in publishing. And I mean, there are parts in this book that like I actually went back to and fiddled with more in detail because I was feeling so kind of hopeless in a way. Like that's a downer, but I really didn't feel necessarily like anything was going to change. And I think this year, we're getting slowly back to normal, whatever that means. And I'm hoping that with publishing, people will talk like face to face and have these conversations, because I think that will strip away my concerns about it being performative. And I think that's really important, to be in the same room with someone having those conversations. So I'm hopeful. But when I wrote this book, I feel like it kind of sounds like it could have been written last year, but I was really feeling, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, so many people from 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And I do think that sadly this book might be timely constantly, but yeah, sad. But that being said, the responses I have gotten from publishing have been kind of crazy and amazing. And I am hoping that this means, again, we will be able to have these conversations, especially from the responses I've been getting from Black women, Black people. They're, telling me they had a Hazel, which is really distressing.
Oh no.
Yeah. It's really distressing, but also makes me feel good that we can talk about it. And I think that's really just what I want. I used talkable earlier, but I'm going to just keep doing talkable.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I definitely, I imagined and knew that you had written this book and had been working on it before all of the things that happened last year, but it's certainly, to watch these town halls and all of these sort of gestures, definitely, it was very, chilling to read that in this book.
Yes.
Okay, so I've got a couple more questions, and then I want to get to the audience questions, which please continue to drop them in the chat. So I heard through the grapevine / Twitter that the other Black girl is being developed into a TV show with Hulu. So congrats, first of all.
Thank you.
How involved are you in the adaptation? How does that experience feel different, similar to writing a novel, working in publishing? What has the world of TV been like for you? Just, I think the audience would love to know about more about this.
Yeah. It's been, again, wild. I feel like these are all my responses, but it's been a journey and a really fun one. I think when I was writing this, I think when you're writing anything, for me personally, like I don't imagine it in that way. I kind of imagine like if one publisher is into this book, great. Like I just had to get this story out. So to have people on the TV side, being interested in this book, seeing themselves in this book, which was also distressing, but also reaffirming. And then having them tell me, I want you to be involved in the adaptation as much as you want to be, like we want you to write. For me was just, I was over the moon. And so, I've got like my little screenwriting book on my desk, doing my homework of watching.
Is it Save the Cat? Is it that one?
No, should I get that one?
That's the one that everyone tells you to read.
No one told me that. Wait,
I kept being told to read. Maybe that's not like the most. Maybe some folks in the chat will have some suggestions. That was when everybody told me to read. So yeah, sorry not to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. This is great. No, mine is it's actually propping up my computer right now, but the Screenwriter's Bible.
Okay, got it.
I mean, I read a little bit of it and kind of went in, but I'm co-writing with Rashida Jones,
Awesome, love her.
who is amazing and
Great.
love her. And she, from the gate, I mean, of course, like I was like very nervous to be talking to her and be intimidating, I think.
She's a great writer.
She's such a great writer and so good, just like, you know, like ushering me through all of these hoops.
That's awesome.
And to feel like I have that foundation, that experience, and like that support, and someone who just gets the book is everything. So it's been fun. It's been fun.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so let me sorry. Okay, I'm trying to see how much time I have to ask. But okay, so let me ask maybe my last question. Then I'm going to get to the questions in the chat. So I like to ask everybody this at one point, which is, what is bringing you joy right now? That could be like books, music, movies, TV, video games, podcasts. Like, what are you digging? What's making you happy?
Yeah, I have to say the first thing that came to mind, which my fiance and I just started watching, is called Dating Unfiltered. I think it's on Hulu, and it's a trash show, but it's like blind date with comedians making comments about it. And I think
interesting.
It's on Hulu. I think for me, having that time to like tune out, because like interviews, talking to people is exhausting, and I just kind of like watching people be messy.
Absolutely.
So that has been really fun. As always, I love still processing, which my friend Margot introduced me to, and a few years ago, these two wonderful Black people at the New York Times who just talk about culture and life and movies, and they just did an episode on Before I Let Go, which I believe, it's so bad that I don't remember if that reference is still in the book, but I'm pretty sure it's in the book. If not, go YouTube that song, because it's and so and then I mean, I've been finding a little time to read. And I don't know, I think someone asked a question about this, but I might as well, it's also bringing me joy. The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. It's so good. I'm about 60 pages in, but it's so delightful and beautifully written. And you know, I think for me, I think reading books set in slavery, the time of slavery, can be hard. Just emotionally, but this book is just so beautiful, and the characters are so beautifully drawn. So really enjoying escaping into that book.
I read that book earlier this year, I think, and it's an intense book, but it also is very beautifully written, and it is a really, like, it's a different narrative than I'd ever encountered about slavery. So that's another great debut for folks to check out. Okay, so let me jump into some of these questions. So there's a bunch of questions in here about process. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing process. Ariel wants to know about how you go about plotting. Do you write with an audience in mind? What's your process like generally, or even just specifically for this book?
I mean, I usually don't plot too much. Like with this book, I had kind of ideas of the two, of Nella and Hazel, of a few points here and there. But really just writing through the first draft was like my process of getting it all out, and exploring one possible way of doing it. And then realizing, I actually don't love the way I did it this time, and then going back and really kind of taking the points and be like, okay, this is actually something I'll keep, like figuring out the beats with myself. And then of course with my agent, Stephanie, who's wonderful and really sat with me a lot during those early stages of like, okay, if this happens here, what's the reader going to be feeling, and is that enough to take them through the rest of the book? Because that was really important. I mentioned earlier, didn't really set out to, I mean, I had those thriller ideas in my mind, but I didn't actually think like, I'm going to have to actually commit to this until I started really digging into the second draft. And so kind of going with it, writing by hand, is a big thing for me.
Oh, wow.
A big thing. I did it. I started doing that when I was a kid, when I was very, very young, and
Wow.
I would transcribe them onto my computer when I was younger, and that once I learned how to type. And so I think for me now, without, I mean, not having distractions, not having the internet, uh,
That's true.
crossing things out, that's so important for me for my process.
Wow. Well, I admire that. I think I'm too lazy to write by hand, but I can understand how not having tabs,
So
not
many.
having notifications,
Yeah.
like I could totally understand how that would be something that would be freeing and helpful in order to be productive. Um, Not to get too wonky for the folks who haven't yet read the book, and forgive me if this is like an obnoxious craft question, but I'm curious of also in your writing process of the fact that you are braiding multiple narratives throughout this book. It wasn't just the story of Nella at the publisher. We said there's sort of a story within the story. So did
Yeah.
you write it all chronologically all the way through? Did you write those storylines separately? How did you configure all of that?
Yeah. So I wrote the Nella part straightforward, and there were a few flashbacks for Nella, of her. I mean, and I don't know how to give not too much away, but there were some bits that were like not chronological, but for the most part,
Mhm.
Nella's part that I had, we just went straight through, and then in the next draft, that's when I started braiding in the other characters. I wrote, those are really ones like I wrote by hand. I still remember
Mhm.
like sitting on where I was in certain sections.
Mhm.
And that was when I was like, okay, so Nella has this thought about these characters. What if we get to see this moment happen for them?
Right.
And so that was kind of my way in of like, okay, so they kind of exist in Nella's mind, but how can we jump back and see
Right.
how those things actually happened? Why Kendra Ray has the experience that she has,
Right.
um, why Diana becomes who she is, like those
Right.
origin stories. Because I think that's important. I think to understand someone's reasons for doing things, for being the way
Right.
they are, is we don't get to have that in real life,
Right.
but books we can.
Exactly. Exactly. No, that's very true. And it's an exciting part of the book. I love when books kind of restart or where they kind of pull the rug out from under you a little bit, where you think like, I think I'm reading one thing and actually reveals itself to be something else. So that's an exciting
Exactly.
moment as a reader. Okay, so this is another sort of process related question, but somebody wants to know, I think Sam wants to know, do you participate in any writing groups, workshops, residencies, or prefer to write solo? And then the part B of that question is, what tunes did you listen to while drafting this book? I think you mentioned a song a few minutes ago. But what music did you listen to as you were writing this book?
Yeah. So let's see. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I already forgot the first question.
Sorry, yes. Okay, so the first part is, do you write solo or do you participate in
Oh,
writing groups, workshops, residencies?
thank you. Yeah, I'm not in anything at the moment. I did my MFA at the New School
Mhm.
a while back, but that was a nonfiction actually, so it wasn't
Oh, interesting.
book was not even a gleam in my eye at the time. Although it was in certain ways of the essays I was working on. But the times that I write, I will write with friends who are writers.
Mhm.
Allison, Charlotte, Christina, so many people that we would have timers. Carrie, one of my friends from UNC, we would have a time sometimes where we would be like, all right, we're gonna sprint and we're gonna write like through text during COVID. So like those kind of moments for me, because I'm usually a solo writer, and I'm a
Mhm.
big going to coffee shops writer.
Same, yeah.
I have to, sometimes that's the only way for me to get it out.
Yeah.
COVID, that got really hard. So I had to get creative and really focus on edits. So that
Yeah.
was a bit of a challenge, but so depends on the time, but very much looking forward to having that coffee shop time with other people again, of like
Right.
focusing. And then for music, It depends where I am and how I'm feeling about what I'm writing. I like in the mornings when I was working on this book, I had quit my publishing job and then I was working briefly at a cupcake shop that required me to wake up at like the crack of dawn. It was very early, but I would wake up like before that and I would write and put on usually like some jazz, like some Coltrane, or like some Ella Fitzgerald, like something that kind of was cozy and slowly helped me wake up. But then like when I really needed a boost, I'd put on like Beyonce and like I'm gonna finish these edits if it's the last thing I do. And yeah, I mean, I'm into oldies. I'm into new stuff. Not as much as oldies though. Oldies have my heart. So figuring out what space I'm in is really the hardest part. And then after that.
Yes, I love it. Okay, so this is one of the questions that has been voted high by the folks watching. This is from Rebecca. She says, were you worried about burning any bridges with publishers? Was there anything you wanted to say that you held back on? And I thought this was an interesting question. I mean, one, it's a little spicy, but I also thought it was interesting because there is potentially like danger, you know, to be a writer who is writing, like to be a person who needs a publisher who is writing a book that is critiquing, satirizing, whatever you want to describe it as, publishing. There is something that's potentially dangerous about that. So were you worried about that as you were working on this book?
Yeah. First of all, shout out to Rebecca, who was my first new school friend, one of my first friends. Thank you for that question. Yeah, you know, when I started writing this book, I think a lot of people have asked me like, were you setting out to write a critique of publishing? And like, that wasn't my intention. I really wanted to talk about the women who are at the center of the book.
Right.
And then the more I thought about why the relationship was the way that it was, that's when I was like, okay, it's because all of these people around them are constantly expecting things from them, comparing them to each other, comparing them to what they thought a Black person should be like. And so I wanted to capture that. You know, there are things that got cut, but it was mostly because I didn't want to bore the reader with all the publishing things. Because I actually found, I mean, I think publishing in general, again, is just such an amusing industry and so interesting and so rich. And I wanted to lean into that, but I also didn't want to make it about just that. Like, I think that this book, I wanted to really speak to Black women, the experiences that we have, and you know, the ways that we're able to sometimes on our own we want to, but also we're forced to code switch to make ourselves fit into these boxes. And so I really wanted to lean into that. And that being said, I'm not going to lie, when I first started writing this, I did have concern that publishing wasn't ready for it. And I remember for like 2 seconds, I was writing it in the beginning and I was like, putting a pin in publishing and like, oh, maybe it'll change down the line. You know, the way that, like you start a project, it'll change. But again, there's just so much to say. It's such a vibe. It's such an environment that really can sink its teeth into you, for better or for worse, if I'm being honest. And so I wanted to really talk about that. But so I feel like it's not as juicy of an answer, but
no, it's a great answer. I mean, I think also it's such an interesting setting because I mean, I didn't know how publishing worked until I published a book. Like there's so many moving pieces that you don't understand as a reader when you go to the bookstore and get your book, and that's as far as you know. So there's so many moving pieces, and to peek behind the curtain, I think is something that especially people who are readers will be really interested to kind of peek behind that curtain. But I think the book does a really great job of showing that. But at the same time, I think a lot of the experiences that this character has could apply to a million other predominantly white industries.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so here's a question. You mentioned that you got your MFA in nonfiction, which I did not know. But here's a question. This person wants to know, what have you learned about writing through experience that you couldn't learn in a classroom? And I'm always curious of that. And I often get that like, was the MFA worth it question, which you don't have to answer that, but the difference between being in a workshop, being in a classroom versus writing a book on your own, it is a different experience. So in what way was it different? And even what way was it different working across genres because you studied nonfiction?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great question. I think that, well, the thing I'll say toward the genre thing, it's funny. So I got in for nonfiction, got waitlisted for fiction, and then ended up just doing fiction because that was something also I hadn't really tried doing that much. Like when I was younger, I would be into stories. I would write a lot of stories, read a lot of stories. But nonfiction was something I didn't really get into until my later years in college when I was taking these classes and kind of being forced to like interview people and talk to people, which was something, again, I mentioned earlier, very much an introvert in a lot of ways. And forcing myself out of that shell was really important, which leads me, I guess, to answer your question about what I learned. And I think I've had so many service jobs. I've worked in a cupcake shop, a pie shop, an ice cream shop. I've worked at a campus recreation center at UNC Chapel Hill when I was there. Like I worked at medical records office in the basement with some wonderful women where I grew up. And so I've had all of these experiences with just so many different types of people. And you can't learn people just by reading about them, I think, and writing about them. I really think you have to be sometimes forced to talk to people and just like open your eyes. And living in Brooklyn, being in this space, especially for me, has been really fortifying. And that's something that I was starting to get those kind of skills through the new school, but really not until I was, again, working in publishing and in this space and had that non-interaction, if you will, in the bathroom. Like that was really what I needed. So that's what I would say. But MFA programs, you know, I can't say, everyone is different. Everyone has their own experience. But I'm so grateful to my program and the friends that I made because they helped me with this book.
That's great. And I love the idea of it. That sounds like a very helpful like transfer of skills across those different genres and different areas of working. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask two more questions. So one, this is a question from Marcia who says, what advice do you have for Black girls and women trying to survive the predominantly white and often microaggressive corporate world? And she said that she loved the book and finished it in one weekend. And I will amend this question, add on to it of just what was, if you have it, if you don't have advice, how did writing this book change or affect how you think about being a Black woman in in a predominantly white industry or in the corporate world? What was the experience for you as writing this book and thinking about identity in these types of industries?
Yeah, I think for me, while writing this book, also thank you, Marcia, that's a great question. And I'm so happy you enjoyed the book. That means a lot to me. I think for me, while writing this, I really was thinking about my own prejudices, my own thoughts, my own experiences, and how those cause, you know, the thoughts that I have about people and about the world. And I was also thinking about just like, you know, these workplaces, I don't think a lot of people intend to be malicious. Like I don't think that well-meaning white people intend to come off all the time. I'm not gonna say everyone, but I do think that like there is another thing happening there. There's this disconnect. There is a reason why, you know, I do think diversity has become this like buzzword and this commodified thing. And I think that what it really comes down to is lack of communication. And I think that's really important to be, you know, feel like you're able to speak up. The thing I would say working in these white spaces, advice, I don't even know if it's advice, but I just say like, you're not crazy. Like whatever you are feeling, like feel it. I'm not going to tell you not to because it is hard not to. But also like know that like there are so many other things going on. Like it is not you. And I think that it's important to, again, I don't know, it's hard because I want to say like, speak up, like call people out on their BS, but everybody has their own line and everyone has, families, jobs, we gotta survive. And it's hard. And I think the thing I would say is like, don't beat yourself up. You, at the end of the day, like you answer to yourself, and like, as long as you feel good about, yourself and what you're doing, that's great. And then if it's not for you, then maybe it's not for you, and maybe there's another opportunity out there. But yeah, it's hard again, because I think it's really different for everyone, and everyone has their breaking point. Yeah.
No, that's lovely. I love that you answer to yourself is a great thing to keep in mind. Okay, the final question, and this is from Lisa, who wants to know, what are you working on next?
The question.
I'm sorry, it was voted up by several people, so I really wanted to make sure we got to it.
It's a fair question. No, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I mean, I'm right now still in the TV adaptation. That's really been the focus for me right now. That, and of course this book, staying in that space, I think is just the best thing for me right now. So I've been doing that. I am part of an amazing, very fun podcast called Dead Writer Drama with Jennifer Cation Armstrong through
love it.
American Writers Museum in Chicago. So we're every month or so, we're talking to an author about a dead writer and their messy drama. So that's been also on my mind, but I'm still very much like book 2 is swimming around up here, and sometimes notes get drawn on the chalkboard wall in the office, but I'm just kind of trying to stay grounded in this world and make sure, put my best foot forward for the TV adaptation.
Yeah, well, look, no rush on to this next project. You did a great job with this first book. Just remain in the moment, bask in it, enjoy it. And I'm sure we will all be thrilled for whenever we get to see something else from you. But in the meantime, we get to enjoy this great book. So congratulations again. And yeah, congrats for everything that is coming your way with this book.
Thank you so much, Brit. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone so much for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much, Zakiya and Brit, for this fantastic conversation. And thank you again, everyone, for sharing the space with us tonight. A reminder that you can buy The Other Black Girl through Greenlight bookstore, and that you can get a signed or even a personalized copy through Greenlight. Zakiya will be coming by to sign tomorrow, so if you would like a personalized copy, make sure to order by 11:59 p.m. Eastern time tonight. You can find that book link. I can talk. You can find that book buy link in the chat. I'll paste it in there again to order online for either quick in-store pickup or shipping anywhere in the US. Just be sure to make any signing or personalization requests in the order comments field at checkout. Or you can come by after tomorrow if you're local to Brooklyn and pick up a signed copy in our stores. We're open noon to 7 p.m. daily. Thank you again so much, Zakiya and Brit, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.